if you see, for those of you guys who are watching through the video, we have this really cool background because Matthew and I are actually part of our youth group, young adult group here at the Chattanooga Church, Collegedale Church. And so it's called Collegedale, Post-Collegiate from Collegedale. So he's also part of the group, I'm part of the group, so that's why we're here. And so part of that group means that we have Sabbath school together and we come together to discuss certain chapters of a book. And today was Matthew's turn to lead out on a very, very important, very interesting book of the Bible. So do you want to tell us a little bit about what book we're focusing on today?
Yeah, so we discussed First Peter. So we've been going over First Peter over the past couple of weeks, and we're in First Peter chapter 4, verses 12 through 19 today. And yeah, it was a great discussion, just talking about going through sufferings as a Christian and how to rejoice in those sufferings, and also, how to trust God during our trials and whatnot.
Yeah, that's true. And I love this, these verses. For me, one of the things that stood out was that rejoicing in the suffering. So we actually ended up splitting up into two groups and discussing. So I was part of a group, you were part of a group. I got a lot of good insight from my group. But what did your group say about that rejoicing in
Suffering?
Yeah,
one thing that we mention is that in our sufferings, we looked at the story of Job, and so Job, if you really read Job, he went through a lot. He went through a lot of sufferings and trials and tribulation, and he was a faithful man of God. And so, yes, at times Job rejoiced, but at times he didn't. If you really read Job. And so one thing that we discussed about rejoicing is that during our journey of suffering, there's going to be times when rejoicing will be a little bit more difficult. And it's okay to recognize that, looking at Job as an example. Yes, we want to rejoice more than we want to feel sad and sorry about ourselves, but I think God allows space for us to be like, hey, Lord, I'm not feeling good. I don't feel like rejoicing right now. Like, I'm going through this illness, or I don't have money to pay for this. But like discussing rejoicing is concentrating on Christ, looking at Christ's suffering, that, hey, I'm doing this because, Christ went through this too. He suffered on my behalf. And so it's a joy to know that you are doing something that Christ did, right? And so that helps you rejoice. And also something that was mentioned in our group is having the end goal in mind. So understanding that, okay, this suffering is going to bring me closer to God. And also, when all suffering is gone, I'm going to be glorified in Christ Jesus. So thinking of heaven, thinking of these other things will help us rejoice in our sufferings also.
I love that. That's kind of similar to what we said, because I feel like there's a stigma or people always say, if you're going through something, you have to be happy. As a Christian, if you're not happy while going through certain trials and situations, circumstances, then you're not really a Christian, because you're not. You're supposed to be happy. That's what Paul says we need to do. And so you're not being a good Christian because you're not happy. But the joy that he's talking about is not an emotion. It's more of like knowing what you said, knowing that God is there with you, and knowing that God actually cries with you. Which reminds me, there's this song, Riley Clemens actually just came out with a song called Jesus Cries 2. I think it's called Jesus Cries 2. And I love the lyrics of that song. It's bomb. But it reminds me that Jesus is there through every step of the way through our suffering. And the song is not telling you, be happy. You have to be happy because God is there. No. The song tells you, cry, let it out, let your tears fall down. because God cries too, because God also validates your feelings as well. And so having that joy and rejoicing, being that you're knowing that God is near you, that God is close to you. I think there's also another part, I don't remember where, but I think it's still in First Peter that says, like, no, Paul is saying, like, bring more suffering, give me more, because I know that in those sufferings God is with me, and I'm closest to God in those sufferings. And so I've had experiences too. I don't know if you've had an experience where you're going through something really hard, and it's very difficult for you to remember that God is there with you too.
Yeah, for sure. Somebody gave an example which I related to. It's just like the whole thing about career, because we're young.
True.
And we think about a career, especially after college, applying for jobs, all of that. And it can be a trial, right? You can go through some sufferings in the process of finding a job.
Oh, yes.
And so one thing that someone said in our group that I related to was, during that time of trial, I can stress myself out through that sufferings, right? I can, are they going to reply to me? Or I can bring myself down once I get a rejection or whatnot. But, an example is like, for example, I was applying to this job or applying for jobs, and I was just getting a lot of rejections, honestly, and it really got to me, and, just reading scripture and understanding this, this powerful message on sufferings, I learned that, I have to let go and let God take care of this, right? It's not that I'm going to stop the trial, right? It's not like I'm going to stop applying for these jobs. I'm going to continue applying to these jobs. So it's like that faith with actions also. But my mindset is different because I trust that God is going to give me a job, right? I trust that the rejections are, God closing the door on something that he never wanted me to go, to. And so I think, that was one example of how I saw, like, going through suffering and, making sure my mindset is in the right place where I'm letting God take care of that process.
And that reminds me too, I was reading the book of Jonah, and Jonah was actually in the pit. So Jonah chapter 2, and before this, there's going to be another devotional coming out on that. And he's literally in the belly of a fish. He's in the pit, and he's thanking God for even rescuing him out of this fish, for like rescuing him from being in the waters and drowning. And so he's like, thank you, Lord, that like I'm in the deepest part, like the worst part of my life right now, because I know that you're here with me. I know that you're using this to refine me. And like you were saying, a lot of those, maybe those rejections are just blessings in disguise, or they're also a way to renew your faith, instead of, like you said, it's that shift in perspective. It's like knowing, this is something good is going to come out of this. And I've definitely had that same struggle with like a job. Oh my goodness, is really hard. And I keep saying that I'm going to do my testimony, record my testimony, but I will.
You have to do it, Evelyn. Yeah. They want to hear.
Yeah, I will, because a lot of that happened when I was struggling. Cool. Is there anything else that your group mentioned?
I think an interesting verse was verse 15, because Peter is saying, if you suffer, make sure you're not suffering for the wrong things.
Ooh,
And then he lists off all these different sins or type of evil. He said murderers, thieves, evildoers. And then he says something interesting. He says busybodies in other people's manners.
Oh my goodness.
And it's crazy that Peter is pairing gossiping with being a murderer. Being a murderer, right? Like, it's so easy for us to, put levels to different types of sins. But Peter's is not doing that here, and God doesn't do that. And we see that gossiping it's just as bad as murdering in God's eyes.
There's no sin is sin.
Right. And I think that's the sin that I feel like most people can relate to, because it's like, how many times do I get myself involved in somebody else's affairs, and that brings suffering upon myself, right? That like now I'm stressed about somebody else,
Yeah.
and this was never my business.
No, never meant for you to be stressing about it.
Right. And so I'm bringing that suffering upon myself, those affairs upon myself. And, Peter is saying, this is not the type of suffering I'm talking about.
Yeah, exactly. That's true. Like, there's been so many times where I'm like, I could have saved myself from this heartbreak. I could have saved myself from actually, like, stressing out about where I'm going to live next or where I'm going to go next. And I really could have saved myself a lot. And I think I'm the type of person that learns from experience. So it's kind of sad. I'm still trying to learn from other people's experiences,
Yeah.
but
No, that's tough. I think another thing that we mentioned in the group about this verse being a busybody, because we were all like, is that sin actually that, like, is it just as bad as being a murderer? And then we started thinking of Adam and Eve. And all they did was eat a fruit.
Interesting.
They just ate a fruit. And
Wow.
in that, eating that fruit, that led to a murder. Their sons,
Yeah.
right? One of their sons murdered their son.
Wow.
And so, and we say that every sin ultimately leads to death. No matter the sin, it leads to death.
That's true.
Because the wages of sin is death. The soul that sinneth, it shall die. And so, yeah, I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing leads to another. I've definitely had some times in my life where I'm like, this isn't that bad. Like, even if I, do this, like, I'm not as bad as the other people who maybe do crazier things. But it's like, no, like, it eventually led me to doing the same thing other people were doing. Like, you got to start somewhere. And same with, like, my parents growing up, they would always tell me, like, they're like, you shouldn't be talking in church or something, like, while the sermon's going. And I'd be like, well, at least I wasn't playing on my phone like so-and-so was playing on their phone. And my parents didn't care, and they're like, I don't care about that. Like, you're going to start talking in church, and then you're going to start wanting to be on your phone, and then you're going to start wanting to play games on your phone. And, like, one thing leads to another, and it's the same thing. They're like, I don't really care what the sin was, like, I don't care what you were doing, but you were disobeying. And I think that's very important. And with God, that's what it is. It's just disobeying. And he tells us, I think Paul or somebody else tells us, like, think about all that is true, all that is pure, all that is holy. And if our actions are not matching up to those thoughts in our head that we should be having, then we're essentially disobeying God.
Yeah, and just on that point again, we can, like, Paul is essentially saying we can, in a way, suffer for the wrong things, but think we're still suffering for God.
Wow. Yeah.
Because in First Corinthians chapter 13, the love chapter says, even if I burn to the stake and become a martyr for God, but I don't have love in my heart, it profits me nothing. So in the same way, Peter is saying that, yeah, you can go through sufferings, but it's not the sufferings of God. Like, that's not the sufferings we're aiming for, right? And so the motives behind our suffering, or the purpose behind our sufferings, we have to make sure it's the sufferings of Christ, that it's genuine, that it's love behind it, and we're not, like, putting it upon ourselves. Yeah.
That's true. That's key, what you just said. You're putting it upon yourself. A lot of these things, we're bringing it onto us. We're not, we didn't even have to suffer for those things. We're doing it. That's good. Do you have one more point that you want to just quickly discuss about what your group said?
I think like the judgment part, towards the end, like, judgment starts at the house of God. It begins with us first.
Yeah, that's
I think that was just interesting, because it's like the famous quote in Spider-Man, like, I might butcher it, but it says, like, too much power comes great responsibility.
With
great power
comes great responsibility.
And so we have the knowledge of truth. We have Christ. We know, the way to live as a human being, and people are looking at us. And we have such a great example that, when we do something, it affects more people because we know better. So it affects society as a whole, especially when a Christian commit something, because we should know better.
Yeah, because people are looking.
Right. We have more influence. And so I think that's what Peter is alluding to. Like, you have a responsibility as a Christian, and also God is making sure, you set a good example for him, and things of that. How about your group? What did you guys say about that?
No, that was a very touched on subject. We said we need to self-evaluate first. We need to do like a heart check and see if our heart is in the right place. If we're doing this, are we singing in church for the praise? Are we preaching at church for just to be quote unquote popular in the church or be known at the church? Or are we doing it because you really, because it's part of sharing Jesus with other people? So it's like having to do that heart check and evaluating yourself. Like, why am I doing this again? And making sure that we're aligned to God's principles and doing what he wants us to do. And it's true, like when we self-check, we're being kind with people, because I feel like Christians can sometimes come off really strong and come off, like we're pushing Jesus down your throat. And it's not that we're trying to. I think some people are just really passionate about it. And I think that's great. Like if I see a sale going on at like a store, I'm going to want to tell people and be like, yo, there's a sale. Like you need to go ASAP to,
Ross.
Yeah.
Marshalls.
I was going to say bad. That's not Bed Bath. Yeah, it is. Okay. To get your candle, because your 3-wick candles. Those are great. So I'm going to tell people that there's a sale on candles. But the same thing. Like if I'm really passionate about God, like I want to share it with other people. But also I have to be careful that my actions are also reflecting God's character, because we're the ones giving our testimony and reflecting God and his character, basically. So it starts with us. It starts with us being the example. I think that's why Jesus had his 12 disciples, to really quote unquote train them, or to really refine those 12 people. And that way those 12 people can go out and share to the world. And so he had to refine his own first before they were ready to go and preach out. And so I think that's what is saying here. Like we will be judged first by what we know, and we need to do the refining in our own hearts before we go out and share Jesus to other people. And I think we can do that with our sufferings, sharing our sufferings too. Kind of ties it all in. We can share God's character and love for us, and by sharing the sufferings we've gone through. And we can tell people like, hey, I went through this, but like you were saying, you were just giving your testimony about trying to find a job. It's like, yes, I was being rejected by jobs, but I'm also knowing that that's a closed door for a reason. So
and I think like talking about sufferings, the most important thing is being other people seeing Christ in your suffering. Because all of us as humans, we go through sufferings. But there should be a distinct difference between a Christian going through sufferings and someone who doesn't know Christ. And so when they can see you go through sufferings, yet you still have peace of mind, yet you still have good coping mechanisms, right? You go to nature, you go to exercise, you go to your friend, you go to God, instead of going through to drugs or other negatives. Essentially seeing Christ in your sufferings, other people who don't know Christ, and you're like, wow, I like the way you responded to that mean person, or I like the way you responded to your boss or to your spouse, or how are you so calm during this situation? Right? Because in sufferings, people need to see Christ, and how you respond shows people Christ.
That's good.
I
like that. Well, wow, this is a great discussion. We could go on and on about this, because there's so much you can nitpick. So I really recommend reading First Peter all of First Peter, but chapter 4 was what we were focusing on, those last verse 12 to 19. So that's your homework. You gotta read it. There's, again, so much. And if you are near the Collegedale, Tennessee area, you should definitely come join our Sabbath school discussions. We start at 10:30 at the Collegedale Church. Or you can go on to Instagram and follow us at Collegedale PC. And that's about it. Thank you so much, Matthew, for being here. And I'm so glad that you're able to do this, and I hope to have you on, more often, maybe.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. This is fun. I feel like I got a second blessing, a second portion of Sabbath school.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was great.
Yeah, and hopefully it can help you guys think a little bit more about, or hopefully this is more of an encouragement, honestly, to rejoice during sufferings. So thank you so much, and we will be here next time. You should follow us on Spotify at It's a DS Thing. Oh, and we're actually now on what's it called? Apple Music?
Apple Podcasts. Apple Podcasts.
Music? Is
it
it
music?
like iTunes or whatever?
iTunes Podcasts.
So we're on there now. Now you can go to YouTube and watch the video of this if you want to see how our lights just went off. So yeah, that's it.
Other people who don't know. Oh no. Do we need to go on?
There we go.
Oh, come on.
Len.
You don't know how to spell my name?
Hard.
No.
Lena. There's an O.
Yeah. There you go.
I was gonna say something. I didn't want to.
Yeah, that's good. So how long is it?